I leaned closer and I peered out the window. Locklear Cemetery was solemn in a dusk light, a sea of jutting tombstones and monuments. The place was deserted. I started to feel a twinge of relief. Rory's overactive imagination was probably getting the better of him again. But then I saw a slight figure, standing in the shadow of a tall obelisk. It's too dark to make out much about him, but he appeared to be wearing a pressed black suit, and in his hands he clutched a very distinctive wooden cane. I shot a startled look at Peter's casket. The wizard staff lay there as always, held beneath those pale dead hands. When I looked back, the figure in the shadow was gone. Did you see him? Rory asked nervously. No, I said. There's someone out there, but it's obviously not Grandpa, probably just some guy paying his respects to a dead relative. I reached out and ruffled Rory's hair, even though it felt forced to me. Probably Rory, too. He looked unconvinced. A slight frown tugged at his mouth, his eyes still locked on the window. I looked back outside with him. There was no dark figure anymore, and even if there had been, didn't mean Roy and I had seen a ghost. A lot of old people walk on canes, so what if the guy out there had one that just looked an awful lot like Peter's? This wasn't the Neverglades we're talking about. Weird shit central. And I had a bad feeling that whatever we'd seen out there, it's just the beginning. 2 weeks passed without incident, and over time I gradually forgot about the specter Rory and I had seen. I had my hands full with other cases. Nothing weird for once, just human crimes with human criminals. A man had been killed in his home with a pair of garden shears, and I was pretty sure I knew who'd done it. I didn't have the evidence to make any arrests yet. 9 o'clock Thursday night found me at the Beaver Street Diner, rummaging through a stack of paperwork and trying to spot a thread in this whole tangled mess. I was so wrapped up in my work at first I didn't notice the faint smell of tobacco entering the diner. It was only when a long shadow fell across the table that I looked up and noticed my visitor standing there. His cigar smoke was a normal shade of gray, and his skin didn't look quite so pallid. But he was still the weirdest-looking person in the diner by a long mile. "Inspector," I said. It's been a while." He gestured to the empty booth opposite me with a tilt of his head. "May I sit?" "I suppose." I gathered the papers I'd strewn about the table and stuffed them back into the manila folder. The inspector took a seat with the unsettling grace of his. He wove his hands together and leaned forward, the tip of his cigar glowing. "I know we haven't spoken in quite some time," he said quietly, "and I know you probably have no interest in pleasantries. So I'll cut to the chase. I found a new case. I'd like your help solving it." A waitress wandered over and asked the inspector if he'd like a cup of coffee, but he waved a vague hand in her direction, and she turned back to the counter, looking mildly dazed. I watched her go with an unpleasant clench in my stomach. "Can you not do that shit?" I muttered. "I still have nightmares about that little freak show you put on behind the rift. I don't need you showing off your god powers." The inspector looked hurt, and for a second I felt guilty, but only for a second. It's hard to feel empathy for a being who's literally bigger than a planet. He sat silently in the other booth, still puffing out that toxic smoke, still staring with those eerie purple eyes. Eventually he broke the stare and looked out the window into the parking lot. "I understand where you're coming from, Mark," he said. "I just want to help." "All right, so help then." I drummed my fingers on the folder of the case files. "What's this case of yours, and why haven't I heard of it?" "Not a homicide," he said, turning back to me. "So it wouldn't have found its way to your desk." He reached into his sleeve and withdrew a series of photographs, which he scattered onto the table. "In the past several weeks, there's been 8 separate suicides in town. None of them showed any signs of depression before the fact. When I questioned their families, I learned that several of the victims had been obsessed with dead relatives before they killed themselves, poring through photo albums, visiting grave sites, digging up old heirlooms from the attic. 3 days of this obsession, and then death." He began arranging the photos with his slender fingers. "All 8 of them drowned themselves in their bathtubs." I eyed the photos with some hesitation. To my dismay, I recognized a few of the faces. Chester Maines, Nicole Kramer, Veronica Stapleton, Mike Schneider. They were all familiar fixtures around town. Chester managed the supermarket on Brook Street. Nicole was our senior librarian. Veronica led the local Girl Scout troop, and Mike ran the auto shop down the center of town. I just seen him the other month to get my new cruiser checked. He'd been a real pleasant guy, always smiling with a bright laugh and a mouth full of pearly whites. The idea of him killing himself seemed next to impossible. Okay, I said, taking a deep breath. Okay, that definitely is on the weird side. What do you need me for? You know this town, Mark, the inspector said. You know these people better than I could. Is there anything that links them together, any commonality that could help us understand why they might do this? I examined the line of photographs. All the faces, even the ones I didn't know, looked like neighbors to me. The pictures were exactly what the news would show when their deaths were reported to the public. Smiling mouths turned to the camera, rosy cheeks, laughter in their eyes. The news didn't want death to be faceless. It's like the newscasters wanted to say, look at this happiness, because that's all you get. That happiness is dead. Now it's just emptiness. Empty rooms, empty hearts, empty homes. Hang on, I said. I have an idea. I flipped through my case files and pulled out a map of the Neverglades, which I'd been using to mull over the Garden Shears killer potential hideout. I grabbed my pen and I marked an X over the supermarket on Brook Street. Then I drew an X over the public library. The inspector watched me work, pensive smoke billowing out of his mouth. What are you doing? He asked. Each X marks a place where the victim lived or worked, I said, placing another above Veronica Stapleton's house. If this thing is widespread, then maybe there's a sphere of influence, an epicenter. It could be like the entity in the radio. I don't know. Some kind of suicide wave. Another X over Mike's auto shop. 4 marks hardly made a pattern, though, and I struggled to think of what I was missing. And then a thought came to mind. Roy pointed out the window at a strange figure with a dead man's cane lurking in the shadows of the gravestones. I reached out and scrawled a final X over Locklear Cemetery. What happened there? The inspector asked. Dead relatives, I replied. He said the victims all got obsessed with dead relatives. Well, that's where my son saw my father-in-law up and walking, at his own wake. I looked up at the inspector. I saw him too. The inspector leaned back in the booth and ran a thumb across the brim of his fedora. Interesting, he mused. Perhaps the victims all saw their dead relatives before they... He didn't finish, but I got the implication. I'm not feeling particularly suicidal, so don't worry about me, I said. Let's just see where our epicenter is. I took the pen and drew a rough, wobbly circle through the 5 X's. Inside the circle was a shapeless mass of trees, and inside them, clear and blue and perfectly round, was Lake Lucid. The epicenter is Lake Lucid. Of course. The inspector shot upright in his seat. Of course, he said. Of course. Mark, do you know where the main water supply for those 5 locations is? Well, I can't speak for most of them, I said, but I know that Locklear Funeral Home uses filtered water from the lake. It's barely a mile from the shore. The inspector rose from his seat and began pacing beside the table. A few amused patrons looked over at him, but he either didn't notice them or didn't care. The water's been contaminated. When consumed, it induces hallucinations, obsession, depression. Enough exposure and the victims drown themselves in it. He stopped and turned to face me. I think I know exactly what contaminant we're dealing with. Do you now? I said. You've known me long enough, Mark. Of course I do. Now come on. We must get down to the lake and stop this thing before its influence spreads across the entire glade. He spun around and strode out of the diner, his coat flapping behind him as he walked. I watched him go, and in spite of myself, I smiled. He looked so gung-ho when he caught the scent of a case. Kind of reminded me of, well, me, actually. Back when I first joined the force. All swagger and confidence and full of the stuff of justice. He's a monster, my brain whispered. He could crush your family without blinking an eye. But that little warning was getting easier to ignore. Monster or not, he was here to help, and deep down, or not so deep down, really, I think a part of me had really missed that guy. Lake Lucid was dark and starless when the inspector and I arrived, pulled my cruiser into the parking lot, and stepped out into the cool night. The moon was hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, and the surface of the lake had a strange, murky sheen I'd never seen before. We approached the shore and watched the wavelets lap at the sand. So the suicide wave is coming from somewhere down there, I said. He looked skeptically at the grimy water. I hate to break it to you, Inspector, but unless you got scuba gear tucked away in some secret pocket dimension, we may be at a dead end. The inspector stared thoughtfully at the moonless sky. Thin smoke drifted from the end of his cigar. Then he turned to me and scrutinized my face. I didn't like it. Made me think of a scientist squinting at a disappointing test subject. Hold still, he said at last. What are you... The inspector removed his cigar and blew a cloud of blue smoke into my face. I coughed and sputtered. The smell was rancid, like rotten fish. And then a searing pain stabbed into my neck, and the breath whooshed out of me in a gasp. Trying to draw in air was suddenly like gulping in a vacuum. I lurched forward and plunged into the lake, my body flailing. I hit the water with a tremendous splash and sank beneath the surface. The lake was cold and murky. Through the cracks of my eyes, I could only make out tangles of weeds and a few darting fish. Water rushed in my mouth, but instead of choking me, I